Zen Mind Beginner's Mind. And also realize that I have a very old edition and most of you have a newer one. So the pages are not closely aligned at all. So I am in Mistakes in Practice is tonight's chapter. It's in part 2 on the right attitude. And this will take us a couple of meetings at least for this chapter. Zen Mind Beginner's Mind is actually really a tough book in a lot of ways because there's a lot of stuff in here. It can sound simple a little bit, but it's a lot here. All right. Mistakes in practice. There are several poor ways of practice which you should understand. Usually when you practice Zazen, you become very idealistic and you set up an ideal or goal which you strive to attain and fulfill. But as I have often said, this is absurd. When you are idealistic, you have some gaining idea within yourself. By the time you attain your ideal or goal, your gaining idea will create another ideal. So as long as your practice is based on a gaining idea and you practice Zazen in an idealistic way, you will have no time actually to attain your ideal. So it's absurd because it's not achievable because it keeps on moving, right? You'll get another one. And yet, how many of us came to practice with an ideal? I need to be calmer. I need to be whatever, less XYZ. Moreover, you will be sacrificing the meat of your practice because your attainment is always ahead and you will always be sacrificing yourself now for some ideal in the future. Now, when I read sacrificing yourself for some ideal in the future, of course he means some ideal of yourself in the future. Right? This is how I will be. I came to be more calm, so in the future, with practice, I will be calm. That's the idea. That's the idea, and therefore the ideal. And in that is implicit, with that will come a more idealized life. Is that not true? If I'm more calm, then I will have X, Y, and Z. So when we have an ideal, it is a Sakaya Ditti, is it not? It's a sense of self that you conceptualize. And then it becomes the drive of your practice, right? Propelling some sense of self to achieve that. So this is then the motivation or the attitude that drives you to a concretized self. Now, first it's just an idea of yourself, but then it becomes more and more concretized, does it not? I should be calm. And then the thing is, with concentration, we all come to practice and it will, if you sit still for even 5, 10 minutes or 20 or more, you will achieve calmness. Maybe, minutia calmness at first, but when you have made it to 20 minutes, I do believe that you will get some calm, or otherwise you would have quit a long time ago, right? In the 4 weeks, people keep calming, 1, because it sounds short, but 2, there's some progress, and it's almost natural. Just like any other body practice, you go to start, if you have some guidance and some constancy, you keep at it, there is some connection. And with concentration, there's some sense of calmness. And so it drives you to even think further that this is it. And many of us get stuck in concentration. The calmness we think is how my practice should be. Is it not true? A good meditation practice is one in which, I've achieved something that I didn't want to, that I want to happen, right? I'm calmer. Most of you are probably not going, I'm present with being unhappy. I'm present with grief. I'm present with cold. Most of you are like, oh, well, I didn't notice a lot. I didn't suffer a lot. And your suffering or your non-suffering is your ideal of what life should be, is it not? Or what this period should be, for the most part. And I'm saying that when you have an ideal and you keep on letting that be your drive, it actually concretize the sense of self that much more, and therefore your ideal of that self gets even tighter and tighter. Because on a certain level, you keep it longer and longer. I'm going to be calm. Oh, this first 5 minutes. Oh, there's some calmness. Oh, well, Reverend Lien says if you sit XYZ, you get to 20 minutes of calmness. When will I get to that 20 minute of calmness? Then you reach that and you're like, oh, here I am. I've achieved it. Now I even concretizing more. So with time, in some ways, a concept of self actually strengthens. So the stronger the drive, right, condition a stronger sense of self. Not true. And I'm proposing to, with linear time, it actually becomes more and more idealized. This is why on a certain level, if people remember me saying, when you find some difficulty in your practice, be it with me or be it with whatever, then your practice really begins. Because that's that when you suffer about your practice is actually when you have hit how the ideal is not holding up. Otherwise, it's perfect practice and you're not suffering. He goes on to say, so the sacrificing here is the irony is that your ideal self is never the you that's present. Because it's not good enough. Seriously, most of PDs or your question in some sense that how you are is not how you want to be, nor is it good enough. Is that not true? Maybe not, but I hear that a lot, and I hear that in myself a lot. You end up with nothing. Because your attainment is always ahead, you will always be sacrificing yourself now for some ideal in the future. You end up with nothing. That's a huge statement. You end up with nothing. So again, the stronger the motivation of idealized sense of self, the more you cling to it, and with time, it gets more and more built in. And you have nothing because the longer the delusion, right, in terms of length of time, the longer your undiluted sense of self. So in some ways, a meditation period in which you actually wake to what is here is actually more present than you think, oh, I've had 20 minutes and I don't remember a thing. Or it's just been great. Does that make sense? Because it's the knowing that you're holding on to some sense of how things are. Because you guys, when you come to talk to me about your practice, you're not talking, there's some report, and certainly there's some like, I've done X, Y, and Z well, and that's great. But for the most part, when you come and you say, I suffer, it's how some part of aspect didn't live up to how you think it should. Be it about the teaching, you know? So therefore, you lose yourself when you idealize yourself. Is that not true? Is that your experience or not? Okay. All right. What else do I have to say that? Yes. You lose, when you're holding the ideal self, you're losing more and more time to know yourself as you are. That's what you're sacrificing. That's what you have lost. That is what you end up with, nothing. Because it's just some idea about yourself. Now, the irony is that many of us come to practice to say, well, I want to be more authentic. I want to live a more authentic life. And yet, as long as we hold an ideal, we are not being with ourselves as we are, which is what? Being authentic. This is absurd. This is back to Suzuki Roshi. It is not adequate practice at all. But even worse than this idealistic attitude is to practice Zazen in competition with someone else. This is a poor, shabby kind of practice. One, an idealized self, you're competing with yourself. So that's already, right? Because you don't think you're good enough, and therefore you have shame. Again, for some sense of self in the future. And we do tend to compare ourselves with each other. And I actually think a spiritual friend isn't one in which you're all lovey-dovey with. Right? It's actually someone you've been through the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And sometimes it's not tangible, right? It doesn't have to be that you talk to them, you get to know them. This is why practice body to body is really important in Zen. Showing up and being in the space and practicing together. Yes, we get something on Zoom, but in person is that much more. When I practiced at Tassajara, there was one person in which I just clashed with them in the beginning, and they were Shika, which is head of guest practice, or guests. But in the summer, they're also head of making sure all the guests' accommodation is perfect. And so I was on the crew. So when you usually come in the beginning, you're in the general crew. And I remember one time, we were painting some of the outside of the pine cabins, of those who know Tassajara. And I thought we were doing it really inefficiently. Because, I'm an efficient expert. You guys know I love to think I'm an efficient. That's an idealized self for sure, right? And so I was saying, oh, we could do it like this. And then they were like, that's not Zen practice. Zen practice, you just do what you are told. And I was like, what? This is not Zen practice. I don't want to do Zen practice. I didn't come here, actually. I didn't actually go there to do Zen practice. I was just putting in time so I could have 3 months to sit on a cushion. I didn't want it to be Zen. I just thought that was my option, right? And then as time went on, that person, I really just worked it out, and there was no definitive way that neither of us, we've talked about it, and we haven't put a finger on what it was. But with enough practice where we were body to body in the Zendo, we had other clashes, but nothing big, but just more and then it just shifted about a year and a half in. So much that actually my lay rakusu, she made the envelope for me. And that was just a volunteer. I didn't go ask her. So there is something to how, and in fact, it is often said, that when we meet people, we idealize them. That's part of projection, is we put our sense of how they should be and how we want them to be and what we want in them that is in ourselves, right? And so we stay together and we practice together to dissolve the idealization. That's part of practice. We actually don't get more idealized. Some of the teachings, sound really like, oh, yeah. And I will say Zen kind of has that, that feel, right? Especially that sudden enlightenment stuff. It's just like, oh, yeah. Pebble hitting bamboo and all of a sudden I'm awake, So that sounds, wow, give me a pebble. Where's it? Let me find the right pebble, right? And most of it, though, is just being with the difficulty, being with what isn't idealized. So our Soto way puts an emphasis on shikantaza, or just sitting. Actually, we do not have any particular name for our practice. When we practice Zazen, we just practice it, and whether we find joy in our practice or not, we just do it. We show up and we keep on practicing, because what are we doing? We're actually allowing for this self to be as it is. In the meditation, essentially, I asked you to notice your idealized self, to notice some sense that was driving how you should be. And then in the noticing that, there's an opportunity to relax into what is. So we have to identify our idealized self. We have to. Otherwise, we think that's where we're supposed to be, or who we're supposed to be. And since for most of us, we don't measure up, or we measure up and then all of a sudden it's like, but there's another one. My gosh, show is just perfect, but now, do I bow perfectly? Do I bow correctly doing service at the right time? And this is why we pay so much attention and we judge others, right? We compare. Practice is constantly, we compare ourselves to others. That's also why you keep your eyes down, because that comparison is kind of like, I don't know if it's natural. I wouldn't quite go. These days, I don't really think anything's natural, but it's certainly a very habitual way. So we just do it because we allow so much of, if we're just sitting, then we're allowing for things to be as they are. That's really hard to do, isn't it? Because we keep, again, if we're not careful with our attention and we know what's in our field of awareness, the idealized self is always the one doing the driving. And with that actually comes the hindrances. Because remember, the hindrances are the drive when you find yourself not good enough. Restlessness and anxiety, I should not be. That's what meditation is. I shouldn't be anxious and restless. There's so much research. Oh, and Reverend Lien says, 20 minutes and then there'll be concentration. And, so there's all this stuff. So what is it to be right with anxiety and restlessness, and to know it and let it be? Of course, we practice to have some calibration, because sometimes it's too much. And we find ourselves so embedded in it, and it's taking a lot of energy, and it's causing more anxiety and more restlessness, or the reaction to that, which could be sloth and torpor, could be boredom, could be aversion. So when you guys talk about having multiple hindrances? Certainly can have a whole series of them, without a doubt. So the hindrances, some people call them personality traits because they're the go-to way we think that things need to be fixed. It's the attitude we bring because things are not idealized. Ourselves or conditions or others, forget that. For example, he says, right? We just do it. And actually then the next sentence is an example. Even though we are sleepy, we are tired of practicing Zazen, of repeating the same thing day after day. Even so, we continue our practice. Whether or not someone encourages our practice, we just do it. Some part of practice has to be self-motivation. Which is what? What is self-motivation? Agency. That's what I'm thinking it is. Right? A sense that, oh, there is volition here. People say to me, how do I bring intent to what I do? You pay attention to what is the drive, and you have volition to choose and live from the drive you want. It's hard work. It's hard work. And doing it in a continuous way or even a regular way is the hard part. Not the motivation, because we all have the idea. So now you're going, but wait, you told me if I think about something, then I idealize it. But now you're saying I should have some kind of motivation? Are you all going, what's the difference? What's the difference? What's the difference?
Having an end in mind?
Having an end in mind, a goal, or how it should be?
Versus just sitting, like he's saying.
Yeah. So you can seed your field of awareness. I would say that's an intention or motivation. And an attitude, Gil would say an attitude is more like the mood. So it can go on for a while, without a doubt. And when is it that we get stuck and we cling to how it should be? The thing is, we can have intention and we can have attitude, for sure. And what happens? It will come and go, and it takes practice to hold the intention in a constant way and to see how that intention manifests and to make adjustment. We think, oh, I have an intention, and so I should get what I want from the intention, which is what? Idealizing. So mostly we just keep on idealizing, which is concretizing, right? We have a concept, we want it to be like this. And that's why so much of practice, Charlotte Joko Beck said, abandon all hope. And she means it as expectation, as idealizing. Even when you practice Zazen alone, without a teacher, I think you will find some way to tell whether your practice is adequate or not. When you are tired of sitting or when you are disgusted with your practice, that's a strong word, you should recognize this as a warning signal. You become discouraged with your practice when your practice has been idealistic. You have some gaining idea in your practice, and that is not pure enough. To not idealize a self is to be with this arising of a conscious sense of self, of being. Which is what? Being awake. You're awake when it's not an idea of how you should be. Because that's delusion. Another way to put idealized self is a delusion. Can we be with our sense of self, because when we're conscious of a sense of self, that's just the awareness of a sense of self. And mostly we think it should be X, Y, or Z, or manipulated in some way. And the idea is, how can we just acknowledge this arising? Which is really kind of, when we go and retreat, we accept the arising of self. And then we call that insight. So in some way, insight isn't some new idea. Insight is allowing for condition of self or situation to be as it is. Yeah. Just think about it or hold it, and you don't have to agree with me. Even when you practice alone without a teacher, I think you will find some way to tell whether your practice is adequate or not. When you are tired of sitting or when you are disgusted with your practice, you should recognize this as a warning signal. You become discouraged with your practice when your practice has been idealistic. You have some gaining idea in your practice. This is not pure enough. Now, in general, when there's pure in Buddhism, it means there's no hatred, greed, or delusion in the awareness. It's not driven, it's not motivated by hatred, greed, or delusion. Most of our idealized self is motivated by what? Hatred, greed, or delusion. Is it not? Not good enough, could be better, not the one I want to be, or not the one I think is. In some ways, when we idealize ourselves, we are being hateful to ourselves. I have any idea of a self we take to be enduring is an idealized self. Any sense of self we take to be enduring, as in held for a while, in time, is an idealized self. Because we keep changing. Now it's just really funny because when I was writing that, I also started to write any idea of self we take to be endearing, right? That we like, that we love. That could work too, right? I love this self, I want this self to be. And so, yes, it becomes an idealized self. You have some gaining idea in your practice, and it is not pure enough. It is when your practice is rather greedy that you become discouraged with it. So you should be grateful that you have a sign or warning signal to show you the weak point in your practice at this time. Forgetting all about your mistakes and renewing your way, you can resume your original practice. This is very important. What is it to resume your original practice? Yes.
To not know what's going to happen.
Do what?
To not know what is going to happen.
Sure. To allow for whatever is here to be as it is, which is not to have an expectation. It's also starting again. You can resume your original practice. We just start again. And that's really important, you know. It isn't so much of how we suffer is we think that time And I know in a relative sense, yes, the continuity of time, right? Like 7:15, we've been here for an hour and 15 minutes, right? So yes, we do use that, and it has its uses. But when we hold that, but this is on purpose, but when we hold that in a way of how it should be, and especially how we should be or you should be, you know, I or you or us or they, then it isn't allowing for a renewal or a sense that everything arises moment to moment to moment due to causes and conditions. So on one level, we have volition. I will say that honestly, I think most of practice, we think the volition is to be awake, right? I should practice that my volition is I'm awake, I'm aware, like this, pure. Now, on a certain level, you know, this is why, right? Opening your mouth is a mistake, right? Right. That's just that they say in Zen. A Zen master's life is one continuous mistake. Because anything I say, you can concretize around. You're going to go, oh, pureness is no greed, hate, and delusion. So, okay, what self is here that I don't have hate, greed, and delusion? Because that's a self I should be. But it's actually is the self that's arising right here. Can you be with it as it is? You don't have to massage it. You don't have to push it away. You don't have to manipulate it. What is it as a practice, mind you? Again, when it's too much, we have tools for regulating. And so much of our practice is actually, what is that? What is the sense of self that's here? Because that's how we see what happens when we hold on to it. What is this? How do I react to it? How am I trying to manipulate it? That's the suffering. That's the anxiety on top of anxiety, which is the dukkha, or the hatred on top of anxiety, or the sloth and torpor on top of anxiety, or the doubt on top of anxiety.